conversation.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Ravi Agrawal. I'm the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy magazine and the host of FP Live. We are here today for a special taping of a show called Counterpoint, which FP hosts in partnership with the Doha Forum. And so I'm just going to ask you all to make sure that you have your phones on silent. This is a recording. And before we start off, I'm going to ask for one more proper warm round of applause for our guest, Hillary Clinton, please. There you go. That's more like it. And now we can start. Secretary Clinton, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Robbie.
So let's start with something in the news. The Trump administration just dropped its national security strategy. What do you make of it?
Well, I think it's fair to say that I'm still digesting it. There is a very clear message from the strategy that was issued. That the United States is taking a very big turn away from the kind of alliances that have been the hallmark of our foreign policy, and I would argue our real strength in influencing events in the world. So if you look at it, there's a very strong indictment of Europe. And in particular, the openness of Europe and the composition of the population of Europe. And that, to me, is an unnecessary division between us and countries with whom we have a lot in common and a lot that is necessary to our security. The sort of updating of the Monroe Doctrine that goes back to a very early president of ours, James Monroe, about dominating the Western Hemisphere, is something that is going to be very difficult to pull off, and we're watching the administration with its buildup of military power and its use in the region, and wondering, where that will lead. But in general, it raises more questions than answers about what actually will be done to implement these kind of very broad statements that are found in the strategy.
So if a lot of that is in theory, let's just talk about what we've seen so far in the last 11 months. When you look around the world, what is your sense of the impact Trump has had on his second term on countries around the world?
Well, personally, I am quite concerned about the impact because there has been a very heavy emphasis on moving away from what I think are core American values in a number of ways. And that's not to say that there haven't been some successes.
Can you describe those values? What do you mean by that?
Well, for example, supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine, both in an affirmative way by very rarely criticizing Putin for the brutal war that he has waged on the Ukrainian people, and then, attempting to try to coerce the Ukrainians into accepting a negotiated ceasefire and peace deal that would be, by any objective measure, leaving them vulnerable to further Russian activity. Remember, Russia has been in Ukraine since 2014, so this didn't start in 2022. So I think that there's a lot that needs to be reviewed and looked at from the perspective of what are the long-term consequences. And I just find that very often it's difficult to wrap your arms around, you know, what is the objective? If it is to cause disruption and hope that that will lead to a better outcome. I've seen a lot of disruption, but we're still not yet at the point where we see what the actual effects will be. So take a couple of quick things. I very quickly supported the 20-point peace plan to bring about the Gaza ceasefire and gave, you know, the president and his people credit for getting that terrible war to finally end. But it's a 20-point peace plan that takes an enormous amount of work and effort and diplomacy and negotiation and carrots and sticks to make sure you get all the parties around the table and try to figure out how to move forward with it. That's where we'll really find out if that is going to stick. I already mentioned Ukraine. I think it's a terrible position for the United States to be in. You know, I was thinking 35 years ago, another dictator invaded a neighbor, namely Saddam Hussein, you know, crossed the border to seize parts of Kuwait. And the world rightly reacted because you cannot reward that kind of aggression where efforts are made to literally, you know, invade your neighbor and seize territory, claiming that, you know, by some, you know, theory it belongs to you. So the world reacted. Saddam Hussein was, you know, obviously pushed back. In this situation, you know, Putin is intent upon taking as much of Ukraine as he can. I think we could have played, both in the Biden administration and now in the Trump administration, a much more assertive role in trying to help Ukraine continue to do the very heroic job it's doing defending itself. With China, if you look at the national security strategy, there's a lot of, you know, very important points about economic competition. And we also, though, have to recognize that along with the economic competition, there's a strategic competition with China in the region. And the buildup of the Chinese military assets are, you know, ones that pose a direct threat. First, foremost to our allies in the region, but then also to the United States. So, you know, when you look at diplomacy of any kind, whether it's trying to end a war or trying to prevent a war, or deter your adversaries, there has to be so much follow-up. And there is an aversion within the administration to, you know, the kind of work that is done by foreign service officers, diplomats, others who are on the front lines trying to fulfill these national security objectives. And there's a very small group around the president who he trusts to do all of this. And I think in many ways that is just not adequate for the complexity of the problems we face.
You know, but part of the criticism that the Trump administration has often had, say, for example, of the Obama administration or even the Biden administration, was that there was too much of all of that stuff. And so they claim that they right-sized the China strategy, which was a direct critique of the Obama years. And in a sense, there's bipartisan agreement in the United States. I'm not saying that's right, but there is, that we needed a different approach to China.
Look, I think that there's a lot to critique in any presidential administration. But I think that there's also a lot to learn from any presidential administration about what works and what doesn't work. You know, for example, I recently saw an analysis of peace agreements, which ones actually stick and how you get to them. And, you know, obviously in the 90s, there was the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, there was the Dayton Agreement in the Balkans. And so I know how much effort went into actually getting those agreements made. And in the case of Northern Ireland and in the case of the Balkans, what it took to demilitarize, decommission the weapons of the combatants, all of that, that is the boring, hard work of actually achieving diplomatic success. And I think there's a lot to be said for the kind of dramatic and bold action that we see from this president, but that standing alone is not sufficient. It may be necessary to get the world's attention, get the party's attention, get something done in the immediate effort to show progress, but then you've got to do all of that hard work. So it's not either or. You know, when I think about the kinds of diplomacy that I saw, you know, in the 90s, that I saw when I was in the Senate, that I was part of in the Obama administration, there are a lot of tools in the toolkit. And among those tools are soft power development, which we have unfortunately decided is not going to be a prominent tool in how we try to, you know, influence people, persuade them. China's filling that gap, particularly in Africa. So it's you know, to me, you don't get into office and say everything that was ever done going back to the founding of the country was wrong and we're going to, you know, do it differently. You say, hey, I've got a different style, I've got some different ideas, I'm going to learn from the past, I'm going to apply what works, and then we're going to go from there. That just makes sense to me, and I worry that we are, you know, shutting a lot of doors, cutting off a lot of our allies, and not learning some of those lessons right now.
So I'm going to come back to Trump and also the future of the Democratic Party. I want to talk about you now. You've been in the news this past week for some comments you made at an event in New York organized by the newspaper Israel Hayom. And I'm going to paraphrase here, but you said that smart, well-educated young Americans are getting their news from social media and from TikTok. And you went on to say that this is how they're learning about what happened on October 7th and then what happened in Gaza in the months that followed. And it appears that this was a broader lament on your part about declining support among Americans for Israel. That comment has generated a lot of controversy, and it's led Congressman Ro Khanna, for example, to point out that I don't think the answer is to disparage the intelligence of young people. It's been a few days now since you've said that. How are you reflecting on your words and the controversy around it?
Well, I think it is a provable fact that most Americans and an even bigger percentage of young Americans get their news from social media. if that is controversial, then people are not paying attention to how.
Is that a bad thing?
I don't know if it's a bad thing, but I think it's an incomplete.
Well, let me rephrase this.
They should be listening to you,
if-
Ravi. I mean, obviously.
People do listen to me for what it's worth, and I am also on Instagram and TikTok. But I guess the broader point here is that if Americans are shifting in their views about Israel, and poll after poll shows that that is the case, that is based on some information that they're getting, not just from social media, but also from very reputable journalists
Right.
operating in the region, also Palestinian journalists in Gaza. Why is that not accurate?
I'm not saying it's not accurate. I am saying that I teach at Columbia University, and I teach a course called Inside the Situation Room. And so it's a very large course. I co-teach it with the dean of the School of International and Public Affairs. And so I've had many, many conversations with very smart young people, not just Americans, but literally from around the world.
And it's worth pointing out that Columbia, of course, has been a center of some protest and action.
And it was.
On
And,
this issue.
and I talked to students there. I've talked to students elsewhere. And in talking with them about their views, they were certainly entitled to those views based on whatever information they had. But they did not always know why they were saying what they said. And all I'm asking for is that people have a historical context, both for what has happened to the Palestinians and what has happened to the Israelis, because we are not going to implement the 20-point peace plan or any other peace plan unless people come with some sense of historical perspective and empathy about how we're going to move people toward what I still believe is the only realistic outcome, a two-state solution. And we're not going to get there if people, when they say from the river to the sea, and you say what river and what sea, and they don't know, which has personally happened in conversations that I've had. I just, but this is a larger issue, because even on other matters in this class that I teach, we are not doing a good job teaching history. We're not giving young people the kind of context that I think they need to be decision makers.
But with all due respect, and I can't gauge how well young people grapple with history, but what I can speak to is they're grappling with the here and now. And they are witnessing images that are live streamed, that are coming out every day, and yes, there is misinformation and disinformation, but a lot of it is real. And I think there's a genuine anger in the United States and around the world that some of that anger is deflected.
But Ravi, I'm angry about all of the human rights abuses. I'm angry about all of the excessive use of force. I'm angry about, what happened on October 7th in Israel and what happened in Gaza. I'm angry about what Russia's doing in Ukraine. I'm angry about Sudan. I'm angry about the Eastern Congo. I mean, I think we should be all looking at the tragedies and the conflicts that are bringing about so much suffering and be dealing with them. That's why the national security strategy is not to my liking, because I think the United States has an important role in trying to resolve these conflicts and alleviate the suffering and give people a chance to have peaceful, prosperous lives. That should be our goal. That is in America's interest. I don't care where in the world you are. So, of course, the suffering in Gaza is horrific. Full stop. Suffering everywhere is horrific. So let's look at what we can do to try to resolve, what is being done to people in so many different settings right now. And I think that the emphasis on one terrible conflict sort of doesn't do justice to the